The focus I'd like to have with you this morning, however, is on the three young men who grew up in Lorenzo's family. The first of these is Giovanni. Giovanni de Medici is the young man who eventually became Pope Leo X. He is the Pope who excommunicated Martin Luther. So part of why I'm looking at this material is because I want you to have that background in mind as we next week get to Luther. So this is his son. This is Lorenzo's son, Giovanni, born in 1475. The subsequent Pope to Leo X was named Julius, and this is this young man whose name was Giulio. He was born in 1478. He is the nephew to Lorenzo. Lorenzo's brother died, and so he adopted this son into his family, and the two of them grew up as brothers in the same home, and both of these guys turned out to be popes in later history. The next character is Michelangelo himself. He was adopted sort of de facto into the family, never officially adopted, but he did participate in the life of the family from his early teenage years. He was born the same year as Giovanni, 1475. The other guy I want to mention, although he's not in this family obviously, is Martin Luther. He was born in 1483 on November 10th. Very good, good. Short-term memory hasn't failed yet, that's great. And so these all are sort of born in the same moment in history, you see, and their lives are, of course, going to intersect each other in fairly dramatic ways. But it's Michelangelo that I'd like to take a little time to consider with you this morning. Michelangelo had been born into a kind of middle-class banking family. His father was a banker, but not one of those upper echelon, highly wealthy bankers like the Medici or the Borgias or others in Italy at the time. But nevertheless, he was born into a fairly comfortable kind of family situation. The father, seeing that all the opportunities seemed to be centered in Florence, moved there, really the year of Michelangelo's birth in 1475. Michelangelo's mother died when he was 6 years old, and the father, who had several children, simply didn't have the wherewithal to keep them at home because he was still involved in his labor, and it wasn't uncommon in those days to farm kids out, to other homes where they might be cared for. And so Michelangelo was delivered into the care of a Florentine stonecutter. And that was the point where he first discovered his own sort of native interest in stone cutting. Now, the fellow that he was living with was not a sculptor, he wasn't an artist, he was cutting stones purely for the purposes of construction. But it does seem some kind of native genius inside of Michelangelo detected in this enterprise something of what would be his own lifelong interest and passion. So he lived there for some years. He had distinguished himself sufficiently to have kind of an artistic sense about him, that in his, at 13 years old, he was apprenticed to Ghirlandaio, He's apprenticed into this shop where indeed sculpting was the enterprise of the day. So this is where he had his first opportunity to really be involved in a serious way in sculpting. But his artistic production was so impressive that it caught the eye of Lorenzo, our friend that we were just talking about. And so Lorenzo, recognizing in the young Michelangelo the genius that he would eventually be, actually brought him into his own family and made him, as it were, a kind of unofficial adopted son, and he spent several years there in the home of Lorenzo. It was at this time, in his early teenage years, that he did his first two really sort of noticeable artistic productions. One of them was called Madonna of the Steps, and the other is called The Battle of the Centaurs. And I hope this is not the most wonderful room for looking at images, but I hope you can kind of make that out. The image on the left there, Madonna of the Steps, this is a 13-year-old kid, And you look at it and you immediately detect how this relief has captured a sort of truly human portrayal of these biblical characters. On the right-hand side, the Battle of the Centaurs, taken more from classical pagan literature, but nevertheless the humanity of them, and especially the emotion that comes through, was really rather startling for anybody, let alone for a young man of his rather early years to be able to produce this kind of art. So this is the kind of thing that got Lorenzo interested in him. You may recall from our discussion last week that Lorenzo died in the year 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed, and no known connection, but there it is. And so that put Michelangelo kind of on the street. He was not able to stay in the family home. There was a bit of upheaval in the family and so on. But Michelangelo by this time is 17 years old. And so there he is living in Florence, and really no steady employment, kind of an undefined time in his life, but it really was in many ways the most defining, because oddly enough, during this 2 years or so, he made a deal to do something illegal, and that was to sneak into the local morgue and dissect bodies. And he did this for a couple of years. And of course, the reason he did it was because he was so fascinated with the human anatomy, and he knew he wanted to sculpt it, and he knew he wanted to sculpt it accurately, and the only way he could do that was to see what's under the skin, not just look at the external expression, but the kind of musculature and the veins and the bones and so on that are part of that inward side of the human anatomy were very important to him. And so even though he would sometimes get sick, he'd throw up at what he was doing, nevertheless he had to do it, and he would dig into these cadavers and discover the innards of it, and so that was kind of his education there on the sly. It was illegal to do that because canon law at the time would indicate that was kind of a sacrilegious activity, to be fiddling around with dead bodies like that. But he had a side deal with the local undertaker, and on that basis he was able to carry out that enterprise for a couple of years. However, you'll recall again from our discussion last year that the Medici family itself was expelled from Florence in the year 1494, generally as a result of the work of Savonarola. So we were talking about Savonarola. 1494, Savonarola becomes essentially the political and religious visionary of the city. The young Machiavelli was at his side, and the two of them more or less became the political architects of Florence for a short period of time, for a few years. But this did put Michelangelo once again in a somewhat difficult predicament, because he'd been closely associated with the Medici family, and finally he was feeling uncomfortable enough that he himself left Florence and went to Rome. And he spent the next several years in Rome from 1496 to 1497, and it was at this time that he produced the Pieta. So here he is, still a teenager, or a young man at least, early 20s, producing this remarkable piece of art that I know many of you have seen. You've toured over there and been to St. Peter's, and this is one of the first expressions of the art of that remarkable place there on your right as you enter into it. And so what you notice about it, of course, is that all of the study that Michelangelo did of bodies now comes through. And this is one of the most striking things about this art, is that you look at the body of Jesus, they're being held by Mary, and it really does look real. You see, even though he's brought this out of marble, nevertheless, as you look at it, the humanity of it, the kind of realistic depiction of what it might have actually looked like to hold the body of Jesus is very much there. And this, of course, as people originally saw it, was just stunning to them, that they would see this kind of realism in humanity. The only thing that's disproportionate is that Mary is too large and the body of Jesus is too small, and that's part of the Mariolatry of the time. There are theological reasons for that, but in terms of the actual just portrayal of the images there, it's quite a stunning piece of work. Well, this is all happening in Rome. Savonarola, as you know, was kind of guiding life in Florence for several years, but he was executed in 1498. We talked about that last week, and because of the change of political climate, Michelangelo felt that it was comfortable, or at least possible, to return back to his hometown of Florence, which he did the following year. And so he came to Florence, back to Florence in 1499. At this point, the prevailing political leader in Florence is Machiavelli, and I want to do a little vignette of him as well this morning, just about 3 or 4 minutes on him, but he's the one who's more or less guiding Florence at this point in its Republican kind of governance. This was what Machiavelli always preferred. He preferred a republican sort of government, even though he's most famous for his writing entitled The Prince. So Michelangelo comes back, and he comes back to Republican Florence. Interestingly, it was at this time that he was presented with a project which became in many ways the defining project of his life. There was a huge piece of marble that a sculptor some years earlier had undertaken to use as a basis for a sculpture of the biblical David. But the project had ended rather abruptly, and this big piece of marble was just laying out there kind of like a huge piece of scrap. But somebody got the idea that this would be a good opportunity with Michelangelo back in town to see him try a hand at this one, to take this big piece of marble and see what he could do with it. And so Michelangelo, over the next 4 or 5 years, went to work on the David, which of course is probably his most famous piece of sculpture. A couple of things about this. This is purportedly, ostensibly, the biblical David, just about to go into battle against Goliath. We don't know why he doesn't have any clothes on. We don't, detect that in the biblical text, but there he is. And he's about to head into battle against Goliath. Now, that's the official party line, but the fact is, this is not the biblical David, and there are certain things about him that tell us that. Now, I want to keep this discreet. This is Sunday school. I appreciate that, but we are grown-ups. I just want to call your attention that this particular David is not circumcised, for example, you see. And that in itself is a clear indication that this is not the real biblical David. Also, he has a lot more in common, we might say, with the ideal humanistic image than with the biblical David. This is the ideal of humanism. This is the height of the Renaissance, and this is the point where an artistic expression of the very best of what humanity can be is intended to be communicated by this young genius, Michelangelo. You notice certain things about him. I won't go through all of this in detail, but just notice his hands are much larger than normal hands would be, almost twice as large as hands ought to be proportional. Michelangelo made no mistakes like that. That was intentional. And it was a way of saying that humanity, by its genius, by its own hands, by its own efforts, you see, can create its future. This David is looking confidently into the future, and this is sort of the wonderful expression of the height of humanism, and at this point, that's what Michelangelo had thoroughly imbibed. I think his philosophy changed a little bit in later years, but at this point, he's really kind of capturing the heart of what the Renaissance was all about. Well, when the people of Florence actually saw this statue unveiled, it was an immediate, just astonishing spectacle to them. The original plan had been to put the David on top of a cathedral there in Florence, but the plan immediately changed, and they determined that the David that had been produced here was an important political symbol, and instead of putting it on a church, they put it right in front of City Hall. And they turned that face straight toward Rome. And this is now David, Florence versus Goliath, the Medici, who are now expelled, who are kind of in the back pocket of the Pope, and the Pope was viewed fairly skeptically at this point as well, because he was aligned with the Medici family and not so, you might say, favorable to this Republican experiment that was going on in Florence. So it really was kind of a political challenge that is being communicated through this wonderful symbol, and it became the symbol par excellence of Florentine independence at that time. In spite of Michelangelo's association with the David, he did, once it had been unveiled, move back to Rome. He's kind of an equal opportunity artist. And having arrived there, he was hired by the present Pope, Julius II, to build the tomb of Julius. We know that Michelangelo didn't like Julius a whole lot. He didn't like any of the popes at that time a whole lot. We don't know that by anything if he said officially, but private correspondence and so on has at least given subtle clues that Michelangelo was bright enough to, figure out some of the things that were going on. But he also needed work, and so he was willing to undertake this project on behalf of Julius. Some of you have seen this. It's in the St. Peter's Basilica there. It's a very famous piece of work that Michelangelo produced. The most famous image in it is the Moses, which is, of course, an image that you've probably seen on multiple other occasions. One of the more controversial aspects of this, however, is the work of Julius himself. Julius looks kind of strange here, and people noticed it right away. That posture is almost impossible to achieve. This is Michelangelo doing something which obviously was intentional, and yet it depicts Julius as looking a little bit odd. His whole posture, the lying down there, the expression on his face, the kind of strange, skewed arrangement of his body and so on, was viewed almost immediately as a little bit of a slap in the face to Julius. And Julius, it wasn't lost on him either. He was aware of that, but once the work was done, what are you going to do? And so this is kind of the edgy side of Michelangelo. He was capable of doing this, and this was one of the more controversial aspects of it. Some people think that Julius decided to punish Michelangelo by requiring that he now do the Sistine ceiling, knowing that Michelangelo much preferred sculpting to painting. And so this was going to be a multi-year project in which essentially Michelangelo would be kept from his first love, sculpting, to do this almost impossible task of painting the Sistine Chapel. Now, we don't know the motives, and I'm speculating, but I'm speculating based on, how others have speculated. So just for the kind of interest or color of the story, I think that's an interesting hypothesis, and I'll leave it at that. But certainly, this was 4 years, as Irving Stone captured in the title of his famous novel, 4 years of agony and ecstasy. It's the agony because Michelangelo is on top of this scaffolding, working in frescoes, and with frescoes you've got to work rapidly, and the plaster and the paint, he talks about the paint dripping into his eyes and on his beard. What a miserable situation of doing this art. And so there he is for 4 years, climbing up all day long, working in this impossible posture there, the agony and yet the ecstasy. Because what he actually produces is some of the greatest art that the church has ever been able to incorporate into its celebration of biblical truth. And there's not one of us in this room that haven't seen images, and many of you have been in the Sistine Chapel and actually looked at it. The kings of the earth bring their splendor into it. You see, here's the finest expression of human artistic genius being brought into the church in celebration of the message of Christ. And many of these images, of course, have had their lasting effect down through history. Interestingly, it was while he was working on the Sistine Chapel that he was visited by Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther was not yet the reformer. This is 1510, and at this point, Martin Luther has for 5 years been a monk in an Augustinian monastery in Germany, and he was commissioned by his order of monks to go to Rome on official business. It was the one and only time Luther ever visited Rome. He was so excited to make the trip and was so devastated when he finally arrived in this holy city. I'm sure the experience he had was something like many travelers had looking forward to visiting the holy city Jerusalem in the first century, going into the holy precincts and finding it to be a den of thieves. And Luther had exactly the same experience. He went to Rome thinking this is the city of the martyrs, the city of, the kind of the capital of the Christian world. And when he got there, he just saw slick professionalism. He saw a kind of superficiality and arrogance about the place that really was highly deflating to him. And many people believe that the Reformation got its start really in 1510 with this visit by Martin Luther to Rome. But during his visit, he had the opportunity to meet and become at least passingly acquainted with Michelangelo. This is before the Reformation has started, but there is some scant evidence And I say scant because this may be proven to everybody's satisfaction one of these days, but at this point there's still scholarly work just kind of trying to figure this all out, that he maintained a relationship with Martin Luther for the rest of his career. And there is some kind of interesting correspondence written in somewhat oblique tones that have at least been interpreted by some to suggest that Michelangelo was maintaining a relationship with Luther and may in fact have been, later in his career, kind of a closet Protestant. Now, I don't want to say that, and some people hearing that would just think you are out of your tree, But if you want my sources, I'll find them for you. This is not my private opinion. There are PhDs out there kind of working this thing through, so for whatever it's worth, you may just want to kind of keep that in your back of your mind. It certainly would explain some things that are otherwise somewhat problematic about the later career of Michelangelo. Be that as it may, the Sistine Chapel does produce some of the most famous artwork in the history of the church, and I think all of us in this room have at least on occasion pondered many of these images. This may be the most famous, where in the creation moment, of course, God is reaching out and giving life to the fairly limp hand, you notice, of Adam. But life is being given from one to the other in that moment of creating the human race, and then the rest of the Sistine ceiling is spinning out the great story of the Bible and redemption and so on. And so it's really quite an amazing thing. All right. As you may know, and I'll touch on this again in a couple of minutes, but the Medici retook Florence in 1512. And so all of a sudden, Giovanni, who had been out of town all this time, is able to come back and reassert Medici authority in Florence. And what happened was the very following year, Giovanni, who had been in exile now for some time, on the death of Julius is actually elected the Pope. And so Giovanni de Medici becomes the Pope of Rome in 1513. One of the first things he did was to commission Michelangelo to do all kinds of artistic work around the city of Florence. He was commissioning a lot of people to do a lot of stuff, and for that reason he sort of drained the papal coffers rather rapidly. So even though he made these commissions, he wasn't able to make good on all of them, but it did give Michelangelo some steady work for a while. And so he worked basically under the Medici guidance, and especially under Leo there for some time, up until about the year 1527. In 1527, the Medici were once again driven out of Florence on separate reasons, and that moved Michelangelo back to Rome, where he spent the rest of his career. The two major works that he produced in this time were, first of all, the Last Judgement, which, if you can see it, of course, the centerpiece of that is Christ himself, this remarkable image of a muscular Christ, a very masculine Christ, who is consigning some people to eternal damnation while welcoming others into bliss. It's a highly dramatic portrayal. And of course, if you're familiar with this, I won't go into the details, but you know that Michelangelo actually painted the faces of some of his enemies into some of those folks who were heading for hell, so he was not above a little bit of kind of, what word shall I use? Well, anyway, he was able to get back at folks occasionally for some of the grief they'd given him. He also was commissioned by Pope Leo to become the architect for St. Peter's Basilica. That work actually began in 1496. Many of you have visited there and, of course, recognize this. It was still a work in progress at the time of Michelangelo's death in 1564. So that's kind of the big sort of thumbnail sketch of Michelangelo's career. The other guy, just briefly now, not nearly as much detail, but just a little bit on Machiavelli. One of my favorite guys, by the way. I love this guy. And I'm sorry that he's got such a bad rap in history. I want to rehabilitate his reputation, hopefully, a little bit with you here. Machiavelli was born into a Florentine family, professional family, given a very fine humanistic education, the finest really available at the time. As we mentioned last week, when he was about 25 years old, the Medici were driven out of Florence. Savonarola was the guiding light. We've talked about his career already. Machiavelli was working at his right hand. Machiavelli was always a lot more of a kind of practical, nuts and bolts political genius, but he appreciated Savonarola and was highly supportive of him. What the state of Machiavelli's heart was, I have no idea. Who can tell such a thing? But he certainly was, at least at this time, a strong supporter of Savonarola's great moral reforms in the church and tended to join him in the central premise of his entire ministry. But as you know, things went sideways for Savonarola, and he wound up being executed, as we were saying last week, in 1498. And so when Machiavelli was about 30 years old, he becomes more or less the predominant political figure in Florence. He was elected to political office in 1499. He was an acute observer of Renaissance Italy, which for all of the kind of glamour that we associate with it was a very tumultuous, bloody place where there was a lot of conflict, a lot of power politics, a lot of knives in the back, a lot of skullduggery, a lot of betrayal, a lot of the things that characterize politics as usual. And so Machiavelli was an acute observer of all of that, and this is kind of where he began to develop. While he was always a strong supporter of Republican governance, and that was always his favorite approach, he was also aware of the practical realities of what politics actually looks like in the world. He especially learned this by observing the Borgia family, prominent in northern Italy and also to some degree in Rome itself, because Alexander VI was the Borgia. Pope Cesare, how do I say that? Cesare was of course, political leader in Milan, and so all of this really gave Machiavelli kind of I would say, kind of a very practical education in this level of political machination. Machiavelli, for his own part, was a kind of citizen militia leader during these years. He fought a successful military clash with Pisa, a squabble there in 1509, but in 1512, as we were saying, the Medici came back, supported by Pope Julius, who gave Giovanni de Medici a papal army. It was overwhelming force. The military militia, there you'd say, in Florence was not able to resist it. They basically laid down their arms and surrendered to this attacking Medici leader, Giovanni, trying to recover his city. Machiavelli, insofar as he had been the leader of Republican Florence, was arrested. He was accused of conspiracy. He was tortured over several months. It was a ghastly form of torture that was sort of the very height of the technology of torture that had been perfected in the late Middle Ages, and all of that was applied to him. But he was finally released in 1513, and he went to kind of a private estate of his, a very modest existence from that point on. And this is where we have Machiavelli the philosopher. So he devoted himself to study and to writing. He worked hard in the daytime, out in the kind of the heat of the day, in the dirt and grime and so on, and then he would come home at the end of the day. And in a personal letter to a friend of his, he describes what he would go through as in terms of this moment in his life. He says, quote, "When evening comes, I go back home and go to my study. On the threshold, I take off my work clothes covered in mud and filth and put on the clothes an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. I'm not ashamed to talk with them and ask them to explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling any anxiety. I forget every worry. I'm no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I live entirely through them." And so here you have now this little older Machiavelli, not a political player anymore. He always wanted, in fact, some people think the prince was actually a job application sent to the reigning family in Florence at the time saying, hey, can't we just, make up? I'd like to work for you guys, but it never happened. So anyway, it was at this time that he wrote the prince. He wrote 2 great political works. One was a description of a republican form of government, which he preferred. The other was a description of more the power politics of government by a prince, which is by far the most famous. I think I've probably read The Prince maybe in my life 15 times. Every time I read it, I am again hit with the genius and the insight. I have personally gotten great tactics for dealing with people from The Prince. I hate to tell you that. But even though I don't embrace the overall sort of political gestalt, of The Prince, there are insights of genius that I think serve any thoughtful person, especially people in leadership. And so I say that hopefully I don't want to be misunderstood there. I don't want to be called a Machiavellian, but I think the guy had something to offer. He certainly had a deep insight into the Scriptures and makes frequent biblical allusions in his writings, indicating and illustrating some of the points that he's driving at. All right, time's wasting, and let's move on. I want to get to Giovanni here. We've talked about these first three important Medici. Giovanni, we've also mentioned, born in 1475 to Lorenzo, became a cardinal of the Catholic Church at 13 years of age, which is a pretty good feat. Being a cardinal is second only to being the Pope. The College of Cardinals, pretty weighty kind of view, but it does speak to the condition of the church at the time, that money could buy you anything. And in this case, Giovanni, the young son of Lorenzo, who, he was a bright kid, but he hadn't distinguished himself at that level of the virtue that might be expected of someone to become a cardinal. He studied theology for a couple of years after becoming a cardinal, and that was in 1489 to 91. Then you may recall that Lorenzo died in 1492, and that forced Giovanni to return home. He was still too young to really take over the family fortunes there in Florence, but he at least was working in Florence for a couple of years. But you recall that Savonarola's influence was turning the tide against the Medici, and he, along with his cousin Julius, were driven out of Florence in 1494. If I say this enough times, it's just going to keep you awake at night because you're going to remember it, and that's my objective. That's what I want. So they're out. They're in exile. So for some 5 years or so, they're just bouncing around in Europe. They're in Germany, they're in the Netherlands, they're in France. They're kind of no place to go. He was still a cardinal, but in the church politics of that day, cardinals needed a power base. Just having the red clothing didn't do it. You needed some place, position to work from to implement your powers in the church and in politics as well. So even though he was a cardinal, he was nevertheless not able to exercise much influence. But in the year 1500, he winds up back in Rome. And when he's in Rome, he ingratiates himself to Julius, the Pope at the time, the person we've mentioned earlier, and Julius finally agrees, under considerable pressure from Giovanni, to field an army. The papal army will support Giovanni in retaking Florence. And so that's what happens, and he retakes Florence, and then, as we mentioned earlier, Julius dies, and this young man now, 37 years of age, becomes the Pope. There were several votes that took place, but finally Giovanni becomes Pope Leo X. And this is the year 1513. There's a very famous statement, pretty well attested, probably one of the most famous statements this man ever made, that he said to his closest associates and advisors when he became the Pope, and the statement is this: God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it, And so that's exactly what he did. And so for the next couple of years, he lived one of the most extravagantly sumptuous lives that you could possibly imagine, with 15 to 20 course dinners every night, lavish entertainments, sometimes of the most abysmal kinds of immoralities going on. And again, I say this realizing that as a Protestant, I can be taken as just gratuitously bashing the Catholic Church, but trust me, good Roman Catholic theologians or historians will agree with this in all of its details. This was the nadir, the low point for sure of papal prestige, and Giovanni was the guy really largely responsible for it. So there's all of this going on, and for 2 years or so, he's just spending money until finally the papal coffers are empty. Julius had been a pretty good businessman and had really kept the funds available to the Pope fairly respectable, but Giovanni is able to just essentially extravagantly waste it all until essentially the bank accounts are empty. So in 1515, he's broke. What to do? He needs something to inspire people to give money to the church. And it occurs to him, I think he probably already figured this out, that there's one thing the Pope can sell that nobody else in the world is able to sell. And with sufficient incentives, you can get people to pay a lot of money to buy this particular product. And the product that he decided to sell, which only was in his purview to sell, was called indulgences. And so Pope Leo authorized the sale in 1515. Next week we're going to see that's the very year that Martin Luther really discovered the gospel in the New Testament. It really hit him the very year that Pope Leo was sending out indulgence salesmen. The ostensible reason for the sale of the indulgences was to do a magnificent new rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome, but it was also, of course, to just kind of rebuild his own revenue. This looks daunting. I'm going to read it to you because you wouldn't believe it unless I read it. This is actually a quote, excerpts from the instructions given to the indulgence salesmen who were sent out, fanned out all across Europe, most notably Johann Tetzel, who wound up in the vicinity of Martin Luther and triggered the indulgence controversy. But this is the instructions that were given to them. Quote, "The first benefit which can be obtained is the complete forgiveness of all sins." Cool. "There is no greater grace than this, for thereby sinful man obtains God's grace." Once again, in addition to the forgiveness of sins, those penalties are remitted which a person could have to endure in purgatory. This is all for buying indulgences, you see, because he has insulted the divine majesty. It must also be noted that each person should have a true repentance in his heart. Furthermore, the person should make a confession, or at least have the firm intention to do so. Furthermore, he should visit 7 specifically designated churches, and in each one speak 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys. Besides, each person must, according to his station and financial status, place a sum of between 25 Rhenish gulden, the currency of the time, and 1.5 gulden in the indulgence chest. The third benefit consists in a share of the treasury of the merits of the entire church. All who contribute money toward the construction of St. Peter's Church in Rome, as well as their blessed deceased parents, are to be included in petitions, intercessions, alms, fastings, prayers, and pilgrimages. The fourth benefit grants plenary remission of all sins to the souls in purgatory. The Pope bestows this from the Church's storehouse of merits on the condition that those still living place a contribution in the indulgence chest. The indulgence preachers are to recommend the benefit with special emphasis and urgency, because in this manner the souls of the dead can best be helped, and also ample funds be gathered for St. Peter's. And this is only a short excerpt. This thing goes on for quite a few pages, the instructions that were being given to the indulgence salesman. This, of course, is what prompted Martin Luther to tack 95 theses on the Wittenberg door. It was a challenge, fundamentally, to the practice and the theology behind the sale of indulgences that has been highlighted here. Well, just to make a quick end of this story, Giovanni, of course, as I indicated earlier, is the Pope who excommunicated Martin Luther in the year 1521 after what was called the indulgence controversy. Interestingly, Giovanni himself died suddenly within months of doing that. He died of bronchial pneumonia in December of 1521. It was about 6 months after the excommunication of Martin Luther. He was still a relatively young man, and it's not clear exactly what was going on there, but I personally think it may have had something to do with God's judgment. So, just for whatever that may be worth. All right. Can I take 2 minutes to give you my Sunday school lesson? I've just kind of come screaming into the end of this with barely enough time. But this is the text I quoted to you at the beginning. "I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. In the New Testament, we have no temple as a central sanctuary. We are the temple. We're told that repeatedly. Where two or three are gathered, there I am in the midst. Don't you know your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? The temple is now a living thing. The house of God is made of living stones, Peter tells us. There's no temple in that sense of a traditional place where you must go to worship God. Where people who are possessed of God's Spirit go, that's an appropriate place of worship. Jesus says, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but those who worship will worship in spirit and in truth. It's one of the most radical paradigm changes of the New Covenant era that there is no temple. Secondly, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine upon it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. How many times did Jesus say, I am the light of the world? And then he said to you and me, you are the light of the world. And he said, don't let your light be put under a bushel. Let your light so shine that men may see your good works and glorify your Father. And I tell you, where Christian people have gone, letting their good works be their calling card, in every dark civilization, the lights come on. People begin treating each other with greater civility, greater respect, greater justice. It is an irresistible effect of the faithful preaching of the Word of God and the gospel of Christ, who is, in fact, the light of the world. Continues, the nations, plural, will walk by its light. You see, that can't be describing heaven. That's earth. The nations will walk by its light. The nations that have been guided by the light of God's Word have flourished. That can be demonstrated historically, and I hope to do a little of that as this course unfolds. The kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. And I think the story of Michelangelo is just one little kind of illustration of that broad principle. The greatest art, the greatest music, the greatest literature, the greatest expressions of human genius that the world has ever seen have invariably been connected to the church and to the work of Christ and to the light that comes through the work of the gospel. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor anyone who is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. There is a true church. Certainly the church has within it people who are not true believers, but God sees the true believers, and the true church is populated only by those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So my short Sunday school lesson for you this morning is whether you are Michelangelo or not, whether you're a great artistic genius or not, you are the light of the world. You are the one inhabited by God's Spirit. You are the one who has this remarkable, extraordinary potency wherever you may go. And you bring light to dark places every day of the week. So God bless you, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do and what God has indeed said we do in this world as we're faithful to Him.